Ernest Borgnine's life reads like a Hollywood myth that somehow stayed stubbornly real. Before he became the grinning icon audiences trusted, he was a boy with an immigrant name, Ernest Borgnine, growing up in a world that didn't promise softness. Born in Hamden, Connecticut, to Italian parents, he learned early that stability can vanish without warning. When his parents split, he spent part of his childhood in Italy with his mother, then returned to the United States carrying a quiet sense of displacement. Too American to be fully Italian, too Italian to be fully Hollywood. That in-between identity never left him. It hardened him, but it also gave him an edge, the ability to walk into any room, any role, any era, and still feel believable because he never tried to be something polished or perfect. Long before studios knew his face, he signed up for something far removed from glamour, the U.S. Navy. He first enlisted as a teenager, and when the world moved toward war, he found himself shaped by a culture where discipline mattered more than charm and survival depended on competence. Those years did more than delay his acting career. They built the emotional wiring that later made him so convincing as both a threat and a protector. It's easy to romanticize a star's late start, but Borgnine didn't simply arrive late. He arrived forged. When he finally turned toward acting after his service, he wasn't a wide-eyed dreamer chasing fame. He was a grown man choosing a new life with the same seriousness he once brought to a uniform. He trained, worked the stage, and paid his dues in a way that modern celebrity culture barely recognizes, moving role to role, town to town, learning how to hold an audience without relying on beauty or youth. Then Hollywood did what Hollywood always does. They tried to put him in a box. With his strong build, gap-toothed grin, and unmistakable toughness, casting directors saw him and thought heavy, enforcer, villain. Borgnine took those parts because working actors take the work that's offered, but he played them with a frightening honesty that made him stand out. When he appeared as the brutal fatso Judson in From Here to Eternity, audiences didn't just dislike the character. They remembered him, and that's the difference between a job and a foothold. Yet the most shocking turn of his life wasn't a scandal or a secret romance. It was a career reversal so rare it still feels impossible. The man Hollywood labeled as muscle became the tender heart of Marty in 1955, a lonely Bronx butcher searching for love and dignity. Borgnine's performance wasn't flashy, it was human, raw, and painfully ordinary. And that ordinariness hit like truth. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor, beating the kind of leading men the industry usually crowned. In a single night, he didn't just win a trophy, he broke a rule. Suddenly, the definition of romantic lead expanded to include someone who looked like your neighbor, your uncle, the guy who worked too hard and smiled anyway. But an Oscar can be both blessing and burden. After Marty, Borgnine had to live with a new kind of pressure. The world now expected greatness, yet Hollywood still wasn't sure how to use him. Instead of collapsing under that confusion, he did what he'd always done, adapt. He moved between film and television, between prestige and populism, proving he could be funny, warm, and charismatic without losing the steel underneath. As the lovable skipper in McHale's Navy, he became a household presence, the rare actor who could feel authoritative and approachable at the same time. And while his career kept evolving, his personal life added its own tabloid-ready headline. 5 marriages, including the famously short one to Ethel Merman, which ended in weeks. People like to reduce that chapter to a punchline, but the deeper story is more human and more revealing. Borgnine was a man who loved intensely, sometimes impulsively, sometimes imperfectly, and kept searching for a version of partnership that matched the life he was building. Eventually, he found lasting stability with his 5th wife, Tova, and that long marriage became the quiet counterweight to the earlier chaos, proof that the man known for playing hard characters still wanted a soft place to land. What's remarkable is how he aged in public without becoming a parody of himself. Many stars either fade or freeze. Borgnine kept moving. He turned up in landmark films like The Wild Bunch, embodying loyalty and danger in the same breath, and later became beloved by new generations through unexpected places. Voice work guest appearances, roles that reminded people his talent wasn't tied to any single decade. The finally revealed truth about Ernest Borgnine isn't one hidden scandal. It's the revelation that his entire life was a series of reinventions carried out with stubborn authenticity. Immigrant kid to sailor, sailor to stage actor, heavy to Oscar winner, TV star to elder statesman, and always, behind every role, a man who refused to pretend he was smoother, younger, or safer than he really was. That's why the world kept inviting him back. He didn't survive Hollywood by becoming a legend. He survived by staying real long enough to become one. Yet even that version of Ernest Borgnine, the Oscar winner, the beloved skipper, the veteran who seemed unshakable, only tells you what the public could see. The deeper truth is that his longevity was not a gift handed to him by Hollywood. It was a constant negotiation with an industry that rewards novelty and punishes aging, an industry that can adore you one decade and forget you the next. Borgnine stayed because he treated acting less like a spotlight and more like a trade. He didn't chase the illusion of being hot. He chased the work. And in doing so, he quietly built one of the most durable careers in American entertainment, spanning eras that swallowed countless peers. After Marty, many actors would have tried to replicate the same kind of sensitive, romantic lead, hoping lightning could strike twice. Borgnine didn't. He understood something crucial. The industry might grant you a moment of expansion, but it will always try to pull you back into the familiar. Instead of fighting that gravity with bitterness, he redirected it. He accepted that he could be both tender and terrifying, lovable and lethal, and he made that duality his signature. When he returned to tougher roles, the audience felt the contradiction, and that contradiction made him magnetic. Even when he played criminals or soldiers, there was often a flicker in his eyes that suggested a full human being under the violence. That's not an accident. That's craft. In the late 1960s, as American cinema grew darker and more morally complex, Borgnine fit perfectly. Films stopped pretending heroes were clean and villains were simple, and suddenly the kind of face he had, lived in, weathered, unglamorous, became the face of truth. In The Wild Bunch, he wasn't performing bad guy energy. He was embodying the sadness of men who know their time is ending and keep writing anyway. That film didn't just redefine violence. It redefined masculinity on screen, and Borgnine's presence helped sell that shift. He looked like someone who had carried weight for years. When he spoke about loyalty, you believed him. When he raised a gun, you believed him too. That range made him valuable, but it also meant he was never fully safe, never the kind of star studios could market as a simple fantasy. He was too real for that. In reality, in Borgnine's life had sharp edges. His reputation as a genuinely friendly man coexisted with stories of intensity, of pride, of stubbornness, of an old-school sense that you show up on time. You do the job, you don't complain. That attitude made him admired, but could also make him difficult in a business increasingly run by image management and fragile egos. The irony is that the same blunt honesty that audiences loved could sometimes create friction behind the scenes. Borgnine wasn't a manufactured celebrity. He didn't float through Hollywood on carefully curated mystique. He walked through it like a working man, laughing loudly, speaking plainly, shaking hands, treating fans as if their admiration wasn't something he was entitled to, but something he should earn. The personal upheavals continued to follow him, not always as scandal, but as reminders that being beloved doesn't protect you from complicated choices. 5 marriages became a talking point, because numbers are easy to judge. What's harder to admit is that his romantic history reflected the reality of a life spent in motion. Sets, travel, fame, long hours, constant reinvention. Some relationships collapsed under the pace. Others cracked under mismatched expectations. The brief marriage to Ethel Merman is often presented as a bizarre Hollywood footnote, but it also reads like a cautionary tale. 2 powerful personalities colliding, discovering too late that admiration and compatibility are not the same thing. Borgnine rarely played the victim in those stories. He acknowledged mistakes, kept moving, and when he found lasting partnership with Tova, He treated it not like a victory lap, but like something to protect. What truly separates Borgnine from many stars is how he handled aging. Hollywood often turns older actors into nostalgia props, trotting them out for award shows and sentimental interviews, then shelving them. Borgnine refused that shelf. He kept acting, sometimes in projects that were huge, sometimes in projects that were small, sometimes in roles that seemed surprising. He understood that relevance isn't always about prestige. It's about presence. That's why he became, for newer generations, not just a classic film name, but a living, working performer, showing up in unexpected places, lending his voice, his timing, his unmistakable warmth. He didn't need to be the center of the poster to matter. He just needed a moment on screen to remind you he was there. And that's where the shocking element of his story lands hardest. Ernest Borgnine became a legend without ever acting like he was above anyone. In an industry that thrives on distance, he leaned into closeness. He talked to people. He joked. He stayed accessible. Yet beneath that friendliness was steel, a survivor's steel. The immigrant child who had been uprooted, the sailor trained to endure, the actor who fought typecasting not through speeches but through performances, none of that disappears just because the public starts calling you a treasure. If anything, it explains why he kept working so long. Work was not just what he did. It was how he stayed grounded, how he stayed real. By the time he reached the later chapters of his life, Borgnine's legacy was no longer just Oscar winner or TV star. It was something rarer, proof that authenticity can outlast trend cycles. He wasn't famous because he was flawless. He was famous because he was believable. And the untold story, finally revealed, is that his life wasn't one dramatic headline. It was decades of grit, reinvention, and quiet resilience. An ordinary man who refused to let Hollywood make him unreal, and who, in doing so, became unforgettable. What people often misunderstand about Ernest Borgnine's late career is that it wasn't a slow fade into legacy status. It was a deliberate second act, built on humility and an almost stubborn refusal to treat fame as a finish line. By the time most of his peers were carefully curating their public appearances, only stepping out for tributes, anniversaries, or the occasional ceremonial cameo, Borgnine was still behaving like a working actor. He would show up, learn the material, hit the mark, and treat the role as if it mattered, even when the production wasn't prestigious. That mindset sounds simple, but in Hollywood it is quietly radical. It meant he didn't depend on nostalgia. He stayed useful, and because he stayed useful, he stayed wanted. There's a reason audiences kept describing him with words like real and down to earth. Borgnine never moved like someone who believed the world owed him admiration. He moved like someone who remembered what it meant to earn a living. That attitude shaped his relationship with fans, too. Some stars tolerate attention. Borgnine seemed to welcome it as part of the job, an extension of the contract he felt he had with the public. He could play hardened men on screen, but off-screen he gave the impression of a person who didn't need to win every room. He just needed to be present in it. That presence became his superpower. It made younger actors comfortable, it made crews respect him, and it made audiences feel like they knew him. But the untold tension in that warmth is the discipline behind it. Borgnine's friendliness wasn't the soft, floating charm of a celebrity trained by publicists. It was the grounded friendliness of someone who had lived inside systems that demanded accountability, where you show up when you say you will, you do the work, and you don't create drama for sport. That's why his longevity wasn't just luck. It was operational. In an industry where reputations can collapse over ego, lateness, unpredictability, or indulgence, Borgnine became an antidote. Reliable, prepared, and emotionally steady. Even when he was playing characters who were unstable or violent, the people around him knew the performer was not. His late-life reinvention also came from something many celebrities avoid admitting. He understood the value of being accessible to new generations. He didn't cling to one era and complain that culture had moved on. He moved with it. He took roles that let him enter living rooms again, sometimes through television, sometimes through voice work, sometimes through guest appearances that surprised people who only knew him from classic cinema. That's how he became, for younger viewers, not just a famous old actor, but a recognizable personality, someone they had seen, heard, and enjoyed in the media they actually consumed. That continuity across generations is incredibly rare, and it doesn't happen by accident. It happens when an actor is willing to keep learning the rhythms of new formats instead of dismissing them. At the same time, he became more reflective in public, the way many long-lived performers eventually do, less interested in projecting strength, more interested in telling the truth of what it costs. And the truth of Borgnine's life is that the contradictions never fully disappeared. He was celebrated for playing tough men, yet his most famous breakthrough came from playing vulnerability. He was known as a friendly presence, yet had a private history of relationships that didn't always hold, including marriages that ended painfully. He was adored as an everyman, yet he also carried the weight of being exceptional, an Oscar winner who had to keep proving he wasn't a one-time miracle. That's a lot of identities to balance across decades without cracking. If his story has a shock, it's the sheer endurance required to keep those pieces from tearing each other apart. In his later years, you could sense that he viewed legacy differently than most. Many stars talk about how they want to be remembered. Borgnine seemed more focused on whether he was still contributing. It's a subtle distinction, but it changes everything. When you live to be celebrated, you become fragile, dependent on applause, terrified of irrelevance. When you live to contribute, you become durable because your sense of worth isn't tied to the day's headlines. Borgnine's durability showed in how comfortably he wore both honor and ordinariness. He could accept praise, then turn around and behave like the same guy who would rather swap stories than dominate a conversation. That perspective also reframes the most sensational parts of his biography. The public loves numbers, 5 marriages, an Oscar, decades of credits, countless roles. But Borgnine's life isn't a scoreboard. It's a case study in persistence. The early upheaval, the years of service, the late start, the typecasting, the sudden elevation, the struggle to steer a career after a defining win, the personal setbacks that didn't stop him from showing up again. Each phase demanded a different kind of courage. Not the cinematic kind, but the quiet kind. The willingness to start over, the willingness to be underestimated, the willingness to fail privately and continue publicly. And when you view him through that lens, his final chapter becomes less about an ending and more about a completed arc. He didn't just survive Hollywood. He outlasted its usual traps. He kept his name, his face, and his spirit intact through changing tastes, changing business models, and changing generations of audiences. The untold story, finally revealed, is that Ernest Borgnine wasn't shocking because he hid a single scandalous secret. He was shocking because he proved something the industry rarely allows to be true, that an actor can remain authentic, imperfect, and human, and still build a career that feels immortal. If you trace Ernest Borgnine's life all the way to its later chapters, the most revealing detail isn't a hidden scandal or a dramatic confession. It's the pattern of how he kept choosing momentum over comfort. He never behaved like a man who believed he had arrived, even after winning the biggest prize in his profession. Instead, he treated every era as a fresh contract, a new set of audiences to earn, a new set of collaborators to respect, a new set of creative rules to learn. That approach is why his filmography doesn't look like a typical rise and fall. It looks like a long, zigzagging line of calculated reinventions, moving between prestige cinema, mainstream television, character work, and later, pop culture projects that introduced him to people who weren't even alive when he won his Oscar. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Hollywood leaned into more complex and darker storytelling, Borgnine's face and voice became a kind of shorthand for credibility. He could stand beside an ensemble in something like The Dirty Dozen and feel like the real thing. Not because he was trying to be tough, but because he carried himself like someone who understood consequences. When he appeared in The Poseidon Adventure, he didn't need to dominate the screen to leave an impression. He just needed to be present in the chaos, grounded enough that the danger felt real. These weren't glamorous roles in the romantic sense, but they were powerful in a different way. They kept him woven into major cultural moments, even as tastes shifted and new stars came and went. And what makes this especially striking is that Borgnine never chased cool. He chased truthful. Even in projects that were noisy or commercial, he looked like a man who belonged in the story, which is the core currency of a character actor who becomes more than a character actor. Then, as television expanded and changed, he didn't resist it. He leaned in. He understood that the audience wasn't a fixed group sitting in the same theaters forever. The audience aged, moved, and reinvented itself, and he had to move with it. That is how, decades after playing brutal heavies and winning an Oscar for A Lonely Butcher, he could become beloved again by kids and families through voice work, most famously as Mermaid Man on SpongeBob SquarePants. The contrast is almost absurd on paper. The same man who once terrified audiences in gritty dramas became a comedic superhero voice in a cartoon that defined a generation. But that contrast is the secret to his longevity. He didn't protect a single image. He protected his usefulness. And usefulness, in this business, is more durable than reputation. Still, the real drama in Borgnine's story isn't just professional, it's psychological. Imagine carrying the weight of being both the everyman and the exception. That's a hard identity to live inside. The public loved him because he felt accessible, but the industry respected him because he was elite. He had the Oscar that proved he could lead, and the rugged look that meant he would always be asked to support. That tension can crush a performer if they're chasing status. Borgnine avoided that trap by keeping his ego in the right place, not absent, not fake humble, but oriented toward the work. That's also why, when people talked about him off-screen, they often returned to the same themes: professionalism, warmth, and a kind of old-school steadiness that felt increasingly rare. He was not a star built on mystery. He was built on presence. And presence, unlike mystery, doesn't evaporate when you get older. It actually gets stronger if you keep showing up. In his later years, the honors came, as they do for icons who endure. But even recognition didn't transform him into a museum piece. He continued to appear, to perform, to speak with the same directness that marked his entire career. When he received major lifetime recognition from his peers, it didn't feel like a coronation of someone distant. It felt like a communal acknowledgement of someone who had been in the trenches with everyone else for decades and never stopped treating the craft seriously. That is the finally revealed truth hiding in plain sight. Ernest Borgnine's life is shocking not because it contained one explosive secret, but because it contained an unusually consistent set of choices that most people can't sustain. Discipline over impulse, adaptability over pride, and craft over vanity. He lived through multiple entertainment revolutions: the studio era's fading grip, the rise of television, the transformation of cinema into a more violent and psychologically complicated art form, the explosion of celebrity culture, and finally the era where voices and cameos could revive a career in the most unexpected ways. Through all of it, he remained himself, not a brand, not an aesthetic, not a carefully managed myth, just a working actor with a survivor's backbone and an everyman's warmth. And that is why he became more than memorable. He became trusted. In a world where audiences are constantly disappointed by the gap between the public persona and the private reality, Borgnine's appeal was that the gap felt smaller. He came across as what he looked like: a man who had lived, stumbled, endured, laughed, and kept going. If there's a final twist to his story, it's that his greatest power wasn't the ability to shock you. It was the ability to make you believe him, whether he was playing a violent man, a lonely man, a loyal friend, or a ridiculous cartoon hero. That believability was his legacy, and it's the reason the untold story still resonates. Because at its core, it isn't about fame at all. It's about endurance, reinvention, and the rare strength it takes to stay human while the world keeps trying to turn you into a symbol. And yet, even after you map the milestones, Navy service, Oscar glory, television fame, late-life pop culture reinvention, there is still a quieter layer to Ernest Borgnine's story that people rarely discuss. The way he seemed to build an internal system for staying intact in a business that, specializes in breaking people apart. Hollywood can damage you in obvious ways, through scandal or addiction or public collapse, but can also damage you through something more subtle, the erosion of self. When you spend decades being watched, judged, labeled, and repackaged, it becomes dangerously easy to confuse your roles for your identity. Borgnine's secret, if you can call it that, was that he appeared to know exactly where the performance ended. He could be ferocious on screen and easygoing off it. He could be famous without acting like fame was his personality. And that separation between the man and the myth may be the most important reason his life stayed sustainable. There were also practical choices behind the legend. Borgnine didn't treat acting like a lottery ticket. He treated it like a profession with a schedule. That means he valued the things that keep a long career alive: reliability, humility, and the ability to work with others without making the set a battlefield. In an era where many stars became untouchable, he remained approachable. That isn't just charming, it's strategic. People want to hire actors who make the day easier, not harder. Borgnine's reputation for professionalism functioned like an invisible contract. Directors knew he would deliver, crews knew he would respect them, and younger performers often described him as someone who didn't hoard attention. He didn't need to. He had already proven himself, so he could afford to be generous. As he aged, his public persona softened into something almost grandfatherly, but it's important not to confuse softness with weakness. Borgnine's warmth was built on toughness, not the other way around. He had lived through real hardship, family disruption, the demands of military life, the grinding uncertainty of early acting years, so he didn't panic when the industry changed. He didn't act betrayed when trends shifted. He adjusted. That adaptability is one of the most underrated forms of intelligence in entertainment. Plenty of talented people fail because they cannot tolerate change. Borgnine didn't just tolerate it. He seemed to expect it, which meant he could take a late-life role that looked smaller on paper and still elevate it with the same focus he brought to major films. In other words, he kept his craft sharp, and craft is the closest thing an actor has to control. This is also where his personal life becomes more than trivia. The fact that he married multiple times is often treated like a curiosity, but the more revealing point is that he kept searching for stability rather than surrendering to cynicism. Some celebrities collect relationships like trophies and grow colder with each ending. Borgnine didn't give off that impression. Even when the public laughed at the speed of his brief marriage to Ethel Merman, the underlying truth was less comedic. Two driven people discovered that intensity doesn't automatically equal compatibility. That kind of failure can either turn you bitter or wiser. Borgnine's later, long marriage suggested he was capable of growth, capable of learning what fit his life rather than what looked impressive from the outside. That matters because it reframes him not as a man who couldn't settle, but as a man who refused to settle for the wrong thing. Another part of the untold story is how Borgnine seemed to relate to his own appearance, something that could have been an insecurity in a beauty-obsessed town. He did not look like a conventional matinee idol, and yet he became beloved. That doesn't happen unless a person accepts themselves deeply enough to let the audience accept them too. Borgnine didn't perform around his face. He performed through it. He didn't try to disguise his roughness. He used it. When he played tenderness, the tenderness felt earned. When he played menace, the menace felt grounded. In a strange way, his lack of Hollywood polish became a form of credibility that more perfect stars could never manufacture. In his later years, as audiences encountered him through different mediums, something else happened. His life began to resemble a bridge. Older viewers saw him and remembered the films, the Oscar, the era when acting felt like craftsmanship rather than branding. Younger viewers heard his voice, caught his cameos, and discovered him without the baggage of classic Hollywood mythology. Borgnine existed in both lanes at once. That kind of cross-generational relevance is extremely difficult to achieve because it requires an actor to be both iconic and flexible. Iconic enough to be recognizable, flexible enough to be reinterpreted. And then, inevitably, time closes in. What makes Borgnine's final chapter compelling isn't tragedy in the sensational sense. It's the dignity of continuity. He didn't disappear for 20 years and then return as a fragile symbol. He remained active. He remained present. He remained, in the most literal way, working. That kind of ending is rare because it requires an unusual blend of health, discipline, luck, and will. When he passed, the public response reflected something deeper than admiration. It sounded like gratitude. People weren't only praising his talent. They were acknowledging what he represented. An entertainer who didn't need to be scandalous to be interesting, who didn't need to be perfect to be loved, and who didn't need to be young to matter. So if you're looking for the shocking reveal in Ernest Borgnine's life, here it is in plain terms. The shock is that he made it. Not just to old age, but to old age with his spirit intact. In an industry built on illusion, he remained believable. In a culture obsessed with reinvention as disguise, he reinvented through honesty. And that is why the story still lands. Because beneath the credits and awards, Borgnine's real legacy is not a role, but a model. How to endure, how to adapt, and how to stay human while the spotlight tries to turn you into something else. There's one more angle that makes Ernest Borgnine's story feel almost unsettlingly rare, and it has nothing to do with awards or famous titles. It's the way he seemed to resist the most seductive lie Hollywood sells, that you must constantly upgrade your identity to remain worthy. Many performers start out hungry, authentic, and emotionally open. Then, somewhere along the line, the pressure to stay marketable teaches them to edit themselves into something safer. Borgnine never looked at it. If anything, he grew more visibly himself as the years passed, as if time didn't polish him but clarified him. That clarity is why people who worked with him often described a particular kind of energy around him. Not the nervous electricity of a star protecting a brand, but the calm certainty of a craftsman who knows what he does well and doesn't need to prove it in every conversation. That calmness also reshapes how you view his most famous contradiction. The man who could play cruelty convincingly, yet radiate kindness in real life. The obvious explanation is he was just acting, but the deeper explanation is more interesting. Borgnine understood darkness because he'd seen enough of life to believe it. He understood tenderness because he'd lived long enough to value it. In other words, he wasn't switching between two masks. He was drawing from a full human range. That's why his performances rarely felt like performances. They felt like windows. And when you look back, you can see him building that range on purpose. He never acted as if one archetype defined him. He didn't stay trapped in the heavy roles, but he also didn't reject them as if they were beneath him. He treated even the toughest characters as people with a pulse, and that's why audiences remembered them. It's also why directors kept calling. Hollywood will forgive many things, but it never forgets who can make a scene feel real. Borgnine could do that, often with just a look, a moment of humor, a moment of disappointment, a moment of loyalty that you could feel in his shoulders before he ever spoke. The untold part of his story, then, becomes less about hidden events and more about hidden discipline. Discipline is not glamorous, so it doesn't make headlines. But discipline is what allows a person to survive long enough for the public to call them legendary. It is what keeps you grounded when you win, and what keeps you moving when you lose. Borgnine's background, years shaped by the Navy, then years shaped by stage work, trained him to respect structure. In a profession that tempts you to become impulsive, he stayed structured. In a culture that rewards excess, he practiced restraint. Those aren't personality quirks. Those are survival tools. This is also why his late-life popularity didn't feel like a desperate comeback. It felt earned, organic, almost inevitable. When he voiced characters and appeared in newer projects, it wasn't a case of a faded, star-chasing relevance. It was a veteran performer adding another format to his tool set. Younger audiences didn't need to know his entire history to enjoy him. They just needed to feel that he was authentic. And they did. That's the strange power of an actor like Borgnine. He didn't need context to be effective. His presence carried its own credibility. At the same time, There's a quiet melancholy in realizing how much of his success depended on not being fragile. Borgnine's career demanded resilience because it stretched across decades when the rules kept changing. Each time the industry reshuffled its values, new trends, new aesthetics, new business models, he had to decide whether to adapt or resent the shift. He chose adaptation. But adaptation requires humility, and humility is not an easy trait to keep once you have status. Many people become addicted to being treated as special. Borgnine appeared to become more comfortable being treated as normal. That comfort is why he could still be charming without seeming artificial. He wasn't performing humility. He seemed to mean it. And perhaps that is the most revealing emotional note in his story, gratitude. It's an underused word in celebrity narratives because it doesn't sound dramatic. Yet gratitude changes how you carry success. It makes you less anxious about applause, less desperate to control perception, less likely to punish the people around you for your own insecurities. Borgnine often spoke and behaved like someone who knew he could have ended up somewhere else entirely. Still a good man, still a capable worker, but never discovered by an audience. That awareness creates a different kind of star. Not one who expects worship, but one who treats the audience relationship as mutual. When people say they miss someone like Borgnine, they're rarely talking only about his acting. They're missing the feeling he represented. That fame could coexist with decency, that toughness could coexist with warmth, that a man could be imperfect and still grow. In an era where celebrity culture often emphasizes extremes, either flawless icons or chaotic cautionary tales, Borgnine occupies a third category that feels almost extinct, the durable professional who kept getting better at being human. So the story closes in a way that feels both simple and profound. Ernest Borgnine didn't become unforgettable because he lived a life free of mistakes. He became unforgettable because his mistakes didn't define him more than his persistence did. He didn't chase immortality. He earned longevity. He didn't build a legend by inventing a persona. He built one by showing up, staying ready, staying respectful, and staying real through decades of change. That is the finally revealed truth. The most shocking thing about his life is not what he hid, but what he refused to hide. His rough edges, his plain-spoken nature, his working-man discipline, and his insistence that authenticity is not a weakness in Hollywood, but the rarest kind of strength. What makes Ernest Borgnine's story linger, long after you've recited the credits and the famous turning points, is the way it quietly challenges a basic assumption about Hollywood, that the only way to survive is to become harder, colder, and more protected as you age. Borgnine did the opposite. He stayed open, not naive, not unguarded in a foolish way, but open in the sense that he never stopped meeting people where they were. That openness is why so many accounts of him, across decades, across sets, across generations, sound strangely consistent. People didn't describe a man who changed faces depending on who was watching. They described a man who carried the same core energy into every room, direct, warm, and grounded. You can almost see how that consistency functioned as a form of power. In an industry where relationships can be transactional and friendships can evaporate the moment the spotlight moves, the ability to be steady becomes an advantage. Borgnine did not need to play games. He didn't need to create mystery to feel important because he understood a deeper truth. The work speaks louder than image management ever will. And when a performer has that belief, it radiates. It changes how they treat crews, how they treat young actors, how they treat the audience. It's not just being nice. It's a philosophy. You respect the craft, you respect the people who make the craft possible, and you respect the viewers who keep the entire system alive. That philosophy also explains why Borgnine never seemed threatened by younger talent. Many stars become defensive as they age, quietly resentful that the world no longer revolved around them. Borgnine appeared to take the opposite view, that every new wave of performers was simply proof the business was still alive. He could share a set with someone decades younger and still feel relevant, because relevance, for him, wasn't about being the center of attention. It was about being effective. If the scene worked, he won. If the story landed, he won. That's a professional's definition of success, not a celebrity's. And yet, there's another untold element that deserves attention. How often Borgnine was required to play against what audiences expected from him. Even when he became beloved, he never became predictable. He could bring humor without becoming harmless. He could bring menace without becoming cartoonish. He could bring tenderness without turning sentimental. That balance is harder than it looks. It requires a constant calibration of tone, especially in projects that might be uneven on paper. Borgnine's skill was that he could anchor a moment with truth even when everything around him leaned toward exaggeration. In practical terms, he raised the floor of everything he joined. That's a rare kind of value, and it's why he remained employable across decades of shifting tastes. If you step back, the most dramatic part of his life may be the sheer span of time he maintained that standard. Think about how many versions of Hollywood he lived through. The era when studios controlled everything. The era when television reshaped fame. The era when cinema became grittier and more morally ambiguous. The era when celebrity culture intensified. And finally, the era when pop culture could resurrect an old name through unexpected mediums. Each era came with new expectations. Many actors survive one era. Borgnine survived all of them because he didn't attach his identity to a single formula. That same flexibility was mirrored in his personal evolution. It's easy for the public to reduce a complicated private life into headlines and numbers. But what stands out with Borgnine is that he never seemed to let personal turbulence become an excuse to stop functioning. There's a quiet resilience in continuing to work, continue to connect, continue to show up, even when life isn't tidy behind the scenes. If his early relationships didn't last, the important note is not the failure itself, but the refusal to let failure calcify him. Over time, he appeared to grow into a more stable, centered version of himself, as if experience didn't harden him into bitterness, but refined him into clarity. And clarity changes how you look at legacy. A lot of celebrities spend their final decades trying to control how they will be remembered. Borgnine's legacy felt less curated and more accumulated. It formed through repetition, role after role, decade after decade, showing people the same essential truth, that he was reliable, believable, and unpretentious. That kind of legacy isn't built by a single masterpiece. It's built by a lifetime of professionalism. When people refer to him as a national treasure, what they're really praising is not just talent, but trust. They trusted him to deliver. They trusted him to be sincere. They trusted him to not insult the audience with artificiality. This is why his story still resonates in a cultural climate that often feels cynical about celebrity. Borgnine represents an older, rarer model. The performer who didn't treat the audience as a resource to exploit, but as people to serve. You can hear that in the way fans talk about him. They don't only list his achievements. They talk about the feeling he gave them, comfort, authenticity, the sense that the person on screen had a real heartbeat. So if the shocking life framing is what brings people in, the real payoff is what they discover once they stay. Ernest Borgnine's life is not a soap opera. It's an argument for endurance. It's the story of a man who began with disruption, found structure through service, built himself through craft, and navigated fame without letting it erase the person underneath. In an industry that often rewards surface, he built depth. In a culture that worships youth, he made age feel like added value. In a business that encourages masks, he made honesty look like strength. And perhaps that is the final reveal, the one that doesn't rely on gossip or sensational twists. The untold story of Ernest Borgnine is that he proved you can live a long life in the spotlight without losing your humanity. You can be tough without being cruel. You can be famous without being inflated. You can reinvent yourself without betraying who you are. That may not sound like scandal, but in Hollywood terms, it's the rarest shock of all.